It's a great pleasure to be here today. It was, for me, very upsetting not to be able to be here yesterday, and I'm not going to be able to be here tomorrow. Unfortunately, in addition to being the Shirley Carter Burden Professor, which is ironic because I'm a guy named Robin and Shirley was a guy too, so it somehow seems to work perfectly. But I'm also chair of the art history department, which keeps my days and evenings very busy. But it's a tremendous pleasure to introduce Kellie Jones as she delivers her second lecture in the three-part Richard Cohen lecture series entitled Art is an Excuse, Conceptual Strategies, 1968 to 1983. Kellie Jones is Associate Professor of Art History and Archaeology and in Art History and Archaeology and at the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia University. She is a distinguished art historian and critic and curator, and doubtless most of you know her work in all three of those capacities. And she has brought to our attention many artists, African American, Latino, women artists who have challenged established art practices. An exhibit that she co-curated for the Brooklyn Museum, Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 60s, opened last month in commemoration for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's an exhibition that asks us to consider the aesthetic strategies that were used in that struggle for social and racial justice, and it's received high praise from the New York Times, the New Yorker, and far hipper publications than those. But it's getting outstanding praise. I have not seen it yet, but I'm looking forward to it. And it's traveling too, yes?
It's going to be at Dartmouth College at the Hood Museum, and then at the Blanton Museum at University of Texas, Austin. So great university.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah. So if you don't get to New York, you can see it at Dartmouth. And in any event, you should definitely get a hold of the catalog. In addition to that, she has an important list of publications. Her book, I Minded, Living and Writing Contemporary Art, that was published in 2011, was named one of the top books of the year from Publishers Weekly. I Minded refers to a kind of visual thinking, and in that work, Professor Jones frames her own articles with writings on her work and herself, authored by her parents, Hetty Jones and Amiria Baraka, and sister Lisa Jones, and husband Guthrie Ramsey. And the reader is very privileged to hear this familial conversation. And I think one of the extraordinary things about Kellie Jones's work is she takes what I think you would consider the privilege of having grown up in such a creative family, in such a creative milieu, and she opens that out in a way that generates benefits for all of us, in particular the recognition that art is really made by artists and not by art historians. And that friction between the world that you grew up in, my sense is, and the world that you encountered when you studied art history, right, has been exceedingly generative and obviously incredibly important for the discipline. Another of her vital publications is Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, which is a companion volume for an award-winning and groundbreaking exhibition that she curated that gave us a much more thorough and closer examination of the legacy of African-American artists in LA, and uncovered a lot of works that had been thought to be lost. And the list goes on. So it's really a remarkable bibliography. And you have a book coming out from MIT Press.
Yes.
And we're looking forward to that. I think somewhere I have the title here: Taming the Freeway and Other Acts of Urban Hypnotism, African American Artists in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s. So definitely look for that. Yesterday, Professor Jones spoke on linguistic strategies, on the emergence of conceptual art in the 1960s, and the mediations on the boundary between art and life, art as documentation, and the goal of making human thought visible. And today she is going to be speaking on Spatial Explorations, which looks at multimedia installation. And I very much look forward to all that we're going to learn today. So please join me in welcoming Kellie Jones.
Thank you so much, Professor Kelsey. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm so glad to be here again today at Harvard. And thanks to you, thanks to all of you in the room for coming, some of you for coming back again, and of course, always, thanks to Henry Louis Gates Jr., to the Hutchins Center, and Mr. Richard Cohen for sponsoring these lectures, and also to thank Harvard again and Professor Gates when I was a Fletcher Fellow here in 2008. So that was also an award that allowed me to finish I-Minded. So I thank you, and I thank you for this, which will lead to another book. So there you are, the center of it all, as usual. 10%. 10%. Okay, we can negotiate later. So in opposition to the gradual dematerialization of textual conceptualism, installation became an arena in which artists could disrupt both the boundaries between and the constraints of traditional art forms. The imminent elasticity of this practice, which encompassed all manner of materials, also embraced by design the ability to present and test the possibilities of its own indefinability, creating a whole while calling attention to the impossibility of totality. In this way, installation retained, albeit in a different configuration, the critical and questioning edge of conceptualism. The shift away from the conventional understanding of the hierarchy of objects and forms, what Michael Fried nominated as the theatricality inherent in minimal sculpture, led to the destabilization of categories. And as Nicholas de Oliveira, Nicola Oxley, and Michael Petrie have noted, quote, a major aspect of the 1960s radicalization of space and the body in space, which led to the development of installation and performance, was the wish to address economic and political realities through an unsettling of the certainties of the art world, end quote. The seeds for installation art were planted in the early 20th century. With collage, for example, bits of the actual world, not an illusion of it, were incorporated into the creative object. This dovetailed with exercises in designation, where a mass-produced item such as a snow shovel became the work of art, as in Marcel Duchamp, In Advance of a Broken Arm. Perhaps more to the point were structures like Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, created between 1923 and 48, an ongoing environmental piece that the artist elaborated in 3 countries and which at one point took over his home. The erasure of classifications between painting and sculpture or photography, film, and theater led to a possible crisis in the comprehension of the artwork. As Frederick Jameson has outlined, installations posed 2 immediate problems. 1, how was this entity to be read formally? What was the medium? 2, how was it to be read as an aesthetic object? But the conceivable quandary presented by the amalgamation of genres and the fluidity of form was assuaged by the presence of remains, found elements, or items of a quotidian nature that in and of themselves contained evocative associations. The use of such items of mass or industrial culture also issued from assemblage, itself influenced by the surrealist fascination with incongruous juxtapositions and the objet trouvé, or found object. But assemblage had a sharper political cast than its surrealist counterpart. In the US, its use of discarded commodities was a critique of 1950s era materialism, where consumerism was practically synonymous with patriotism. At the same time that the use of found materials signaled waste, it also raised the specter of those living on the edge, making do with the leftovers of the industrial world. Process, also known as anti-formal art, post-minimalism, or in a phrase coined by critic Lucy Lepard, eccentric abstraction, seemed to rise out of the ashes of assemblage. It was interested less in the narrative of forsaken commodities than in what the materials themselves, primarily those of industry, could chronicle. As the name suggests, process artists were concerned as much with the operations of making something and having these workings visible as with the final product. With the war raging in Southeast Asia, civil rights protests in the US, and the rise of student demonstrations worldwide, the anti-form of process could also be read as manifesting a skepticism towards authority. Such cynicism could be seen in these eminently floor-based and irreverent pieces that question the validity of traditional objects. Installation drew on assemblage and process in its three-dimensional and horizontal orientation and its ability to bring other realities into art's discursive universe. From this expansiveness of form and meaning emerged a fresh way to understand what art could be. As Jameson has outlined, quote, because it proposes a new mode of looking, installation has overturned our reading of the object. In that it is an indexical practice, it does not signify the real, but participates in its antagonistic movements by placing the spectator in a disjunction of often incompatible spaces. The observer thus became the focus and the viewing subject of this new art form. Art became a bodily experience, not just a visual one. It was transformed into a place and a place in time. It was recast as a participatory space, one in which the audience was often encouraged to touch, smell, and hear, in effect to apply all its senses to appreciate and complete the work of art. The physical navigation of this environment was matched by its mental equivalent. The interpretation of an installation was created by the viewer scanning, in Jameson's words, quote, moving back and forth across the text, end quote. If the dislocated objects and eccentric materials of assemblage and process seem to provide strong foundations for our material understanding of installation, it was minimalism that supplied the trope of the participating body. While numerous styles in 20th century Western art, from Dada and Situationism to Fluxus, had also conceived of forms to stimulate greater audience awareness and engagement, minimalism imagined the viewer as a physical construct, which provided a counterpoint to the sculptural object. One commonality between the scattered sculpted or room-like projects by David Hammond, Senga Nengudi, Sebastian, Lourdes Grobet, and collectives Marso and Proceso Pentágono was their underlying critique of the gallery space. By the 60s and 70s, this arena was no longer viewed as a neutral site of display, but as an antiseptic white cube where the production of aesthetic and commercial value was manufactured. Though much of the artwork produced during the period challenged the pretentiousness and elitism of the gallery as well as the museum, installations confronted these hallowed houses of art by both mimicking and conquering their physical environments. Between 1968 and 1978, Sebastian, born Enrique Carvajal Gonzalez, was a moving force or principal animator of various artist groups interested in issues of geometricism and the concept of urban utopias. These included Arte Otro between 68 and 69, Tetrahedro in 77, and Marso, 78 to 82, which approached the art-making process as a means to resolve theoretical and conceptual problems. On the other hand, Gugadika Gosse of 75 and the creators of Espacio Escultórico of 78 concentrated on the production of sculpture for public spaces. In Mexico, conceptual practice became most identified with the group movement of the 1970s. 10 to 20 collectives located in various parts of the country were active during the period. Los Grupos, as they were known, produced public art, artist books, performances, installations, and graphics. Some of the initial groups in this movement were more classically activist and formed the Mexican Front of Cultural Workers Groups, using their work to support union rallies and other political activities. Sebastian became the elder statesman of Marzo, part of the second wave of Mexican artist groups that came into being later in the 1970s. While these later groups shared certain communal concepts as well as an interest in the urban recontextualization of public art with their more politically focused predecessors, their activities were primarily confined to the development of visual language through explorations of vanguard art tendencies. Describing themselves as an urban object, Marzo devised their own vocabulary of visual textual codes. Their work was highly ephemeral, including murals on paper and a variety of practices gathered under the rubric of urban poems. They were influenced by concrete poetry, which sprang up in Brazil and Germany in the 1950s, with its interest in demystifying art, a concern with forging a connection to a larger public, and the concept of language as a physical, manipulable element. Marzo's urban poems were broken down into two types, geographic and topographic. With topographic poems, Marzo took on the teeming metropolis of late 20th century Mexico as muse. Members would go out armed with simple school chalk, and they would leave short and ephemeral verses on benches, walls, but primarily on the streets themselves. These lyrical, if modest lines, called attention to the beauty in the mundane, but also to the problems that plague the urban context. Geographic poems were formed through audience participation. In the expansive plazas found throughout Mexico City, Marzo would set up shop simply with an assortment of single words printed on cardstock a little larger than a standard piece of letter-sized paper. Passers-by were encouraged to select a word and add it to a collective poem taking shape on the old stone streets. Through the actual physical manipulation of text, Marzo was able to create a space for public dialogue in the urban environment. Because of the politics of the time, many of these actions resulted in the creation of protest poems as people let their imaginations, fantasies, or spontaneous expressions prevail. Marzo eventually abandoned these techniques. In the climate of 70s Mexico, the artists found themselves being harassed. The urban poems appeared almost as guerrilla actions and were viewed by local authorities as subversive. During the 70s, Sebastian also embarked on his own series of small sculptures whose subtle but tangible presence activated the milieu of the gallery space. Fashioned largely of folded paper, cardboard, and rope, these works indicated the artist's ongoing fascination with geometric structure as a vehicle of metamorphosis. It enlisted spectators in the continual articulation and re-articulation of the pieces and consequently the space itself. Sebastian titled many of these works desplegables, which he called in English transformables, and though a more literal translation would be unfoldables. Without this very tangible connection with the audience, the sculpture almost didn't exist. In these works, Sebastian was fascinated with issues of sculptural interiority that also captivated other sculptors linked with minimalism. The desplegables had the ability to move from thin strips of paper to fully three-dimensional form and back, and in doing so, questioned the solidity and the very structure of the sculptural entity. But perhaps the characteristic that most united Sebastian with minimalist investigations was the constant of legible geometry. Such configurations had been the building blocks of artistic as well as architectural form since ancient times. They were shapes that could be automatically recalled by artists and instantly recognized by viewers. As part of the group Gugadikagose, very hard word, in 1975, Sebastian and 4 other sculptors created large-scale individual but related pieces throughout the town of Villahermosa, Tabasco. Constructed at the end of '78, along with Matías Gerowitz, Ursúa Elena Escobedo, Manuel Felgueres, and Frederico Silva, Espacio Escultórico consisted of 64 isometric triangular pyramids of hollow cast concrete arranged in a ring around a core of natural space. Sited at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, the work measured almost a quarter of a mile in diameter with 9-foot expanses between each 15-foot high segment, allowing the movement of spectators to flow throughout the total environment. While drawing on a contemporary understanding of minimalism's specific object, there is no doubt that this piece also derived its meaning from Mexican experiences with geometricism as well as pre-Hispanic architectural strategies. In the 1970s, what also became registered immediately in the space of installation was the vibrancy of the urban landscape. Mexico City, Los Angeles, and New York, that were home to these artists, were cities brimming with possibilities, sights, and sounds, sumptuous examples of arrangement and embellishment. Installation could also be imagined in the pliant space of the arrabal, the sometimes desolate and empty lot on the edge of town. In the words of Carlos Monsiváis, these were, quote, poor spaces located at the city's margins, naturally distanced from respectable society, and equally separated from both reality and conventional illusion, end quote. However, these were not just decaying slumscapes. That simply provided impetus and material for many working in this mode. Okay. Okay. However, these were not just decaying slumscapes that provided impetus and material for many working in this mode of greater interest for the artists under review, was the suggestion of the body that was inscribed there. The riots in Watts and the massacre at Tlatelolco were momentous events in the chronicles of African America and Mexico, respectively. However, they placed in relief some of the signal issues arising in the urban landscape concerning growing populations, access to services and political power, and the government's perceived need for social control. This was certainly an inspiration for David Hammons. After a decade of success with works on paper, the popular body prints, David Hammons walked away from these framed and easily saleable objects. Hammons' immersion in the Southern California art scene, home to strong currents of funk and assemblage, was another impetus for the change of practice. Since his arrival in Los Angeles in the early 60s, a critical mass of African-American artists, including Betty Saar and Noah Purifoy, had increasingly worked in this manner, lacing their constructions with an edge of African-American cultural symbolism. Hair, that tangible crown of African-American difference, was one such common item that Hammond submitted to this new, active, and all-encompassing approach to art making, and through which his work moved more clearly into the realm of the environmental. The artist first used this material in a series of works, primarily for the wall, which were constructed from discarded brown paper bags, painted with common household oil, and embellished with sparrow bones, glitter, and rounded tufts of hair. These were exhibited in New York at the Just Above Midtown Gallery in 1975 under the title Greasy Bags and Barbecue Bones. During that same year, he installed what would become a sporadic series of sculptural arrangements along Los Angeles beaches. An array of nappy hair balls approximately a half an inch in less in diameter were threaded on lengths of flexible wire standing 3 to 5 feet high. The wires were curved and bent in places, and the tufts followed their lines, creating irregular dashes and dots, like some newfound system of counting, an African-Americanized version of Morse code, abacus, or quipu. Hammons cultivated his new gardens at the shoreline, taking advantage of the solidity of the wet sand for planting the wires and the drama of the crashing waves on the horizon and the mirror-like reflective ground to add to the work's potency. Temporary and ephemeral, Hammons planted and replanted his hair gardens in a variety of Los Angeles beach sites between 1975 and 1977. If American process works and European arte povera had used all sorts of materials from felt to hay and chalk to dirt, no one had worked with black hair in such a manner. Hammond's installations, taking place during the hoopla of the bicentennial period, were both a celebration of the incredible facets of black hair and, by extension, the black self, and a subtle reminder of the place of the black body as commodity in the making of the United States. Hammons also recreated these gardens indoors, along with hair pyramids that covered the floor. The results of the discovery by the artist that sifted hair, when placed in a mold, could provide its own support. Having done his groundwork, Hammons then went for the heavens. Gray Skies Over Harlem appears in the seminal book Contextures, published by Just Above Midtown Gallery in '78. It is described as a ceiling piece designed to make people look up, thus jolting their natural and usual position and relationship to the art object. Intermixed with their plain metal counterparts, plastic-coated pink, orange, and white wires threaded with hair curve along the surface in a sinuous automatist scrawl. Allusions to flying and the celestial are the dominant tropes in a series of wall sculptures created from the 70s into the 80s, all bearing the title Flight Fantasy. The flexible metal wires are replaced with thin wooden dowels that wave softly with any slight air current or movement. The dowels thrust out 2 to 3 feet on either side of a central axis, forming wing-like arrangements. These appendages are festooned with, among other things, hair particles, feathers, and shards of 45 RPM records that add visually to the sense of fluttering and sustained motion. Hammons extended these ideas in Flight Fantasies, that's plural, a project for the new Atlanta International Airport in 1980. Located at Concourse C, it was the artist's first large-scale public commission. Senga Nengudi, Hammond's fellow Angelino, also explored art's activation of space and people's activation of art, using a visual language that had clearly learned lessons from assemblage and process. Like Hammond's, Nengudi at once foregrounded and abstracted the body as central trope, creating visceral work that was also palpably sensual. Although critic and curator April Kingsley claimed in 1980 that Senga Nengudi saw herself primarily as a performance artist, it is clear that during the period under study, like other artists discussed here, she was involved equally with both the manipulation of the performative body and the construction of three-dimensional objects. Like Hammond's, Nengudi's work found a home at New York's Just Above Midtown Gallery, a place for vanguard work by African-American artists, which represented her from '76 to '82. It was around this time that the artist developed her signature style, employing pantyhose, which she sometimes referred to as nylon mesh, and sand, as well as other pliable found materials like rubber and foam. Such pieces advanced bodily associations. With their skin-like forms, stretched and pulled linear extensions and appendages, tied and knotted lengths of this malleable fabric were filled with sand and shaped, twisted, suspended from walls and ceilings, then sometimes coming to rest on the floor of any given gallery space. As Nengudi acknowledged, quote, "I am working with nylon mesh because it relates to the elasticity of the human body. From tender, tight beginnings to sagging and. The body can only stand so much push and pull until it gives way, never to resume its original shape. After giving birth to my own son, I thought of black wet nurses suckling child after child, their own as well as those of others, until their breasts rested upon their knees, their energies drained. My works are abstracted reflections of used bodies, visual images that serve my aesthetic decisions as well as my ideas," end quote. The pliant nature of these pieces was not just part of their anti-sculptural environmental orientation or feminist bearing. They were meant to be caressed, fondled, and stroked by the artist as well as viewers. And the title of this series, as you can see, is RSVP, Respondez-vous s'il vous plaît, right? So that's encouraging people to respond, to be, engaged with the work. Of course, today, when it's at MoMA, we can't do that, or even in my show at the Hammer, we did not allow people to do that. But that was the original intent with her, titling this whole series RSVP. The public coming together of Nengudi's performative and sculptural interests can be seen more fully in photographs of her solo show at the Pearl C. Woods Gallery in May '77. In line with her choreographic bent, we find her work enmeshing fellow artist Maren Hassinger. Lengths of dark nylon fiber radiate out from Hassinger's torso, literally mooring her to the wall. If Nengudi followed the path of so many other of California's modern-day bricoleurs, she was of a younger generation, including Hammons, Hassinger, and Houston Conwell, that valued such strategies as part of an active and participatory practice. Lourdes Grobet was beginning to make her first mature statements as an artist in 1970s Mexico. Although an early work, Serendipity, of 1970, appeared to simply engage primary sculptural form, Grobet was, like Nengudi, equally concerned with exploring ideas of bodily structure. If the massacre at Tlatelolco had a profound effect on the daily lives and the psyches of the Mexican people, it affected as well not only how artists viewed their practice, but the material conditions of art making itself. The student movement of '68 focused on the rapid distribution of information that was intellectually and visually accessible, and which centered thematically on the social and political realities of the larger populace. These strategies were increasingly taken up as aesthetic codes by artists and saw their heyday in the group movement that was a force in Mexican art from the middle of the 1970s through the early 1980s. Lourdes Grobet trained originally as a painter at Mexico City's Ibero-American University between 1960 and '62, studying with artists such as sculptor Matthias Gerowitz, painter Manuel Felgueres, and Katy Horna, a photographer whose images were recognized for their surrealist edge. From her earliest engagement with the medium that would become her primary métier, Lourdes Grobet had approached photography from the standpoint of its social effectiveness and relevance for a larger community, yet with an expanded understanding of use. Towards the end of the 1960s, she began working with a small press, adapting her fine art skills to the requisite demands of serialization, dissemination, and legibility. Grobet's first major exhibition took place at Mexico City's Gallery Jack Mizrachi in 1970. On view was a single work, Serendipity, a large labyrinth that took over the entire gallery space. Done in collaboration with anthropologist Silvia Gomez-Tagle, it appeared as an anonymous production. The creators' names were neither found on the invitation nor in the catalog. The reason for this anonymity and the shunning of publicity was on the one hand to let the piece speak for itself, but on the other, the work's content also made this somewhat of a necessity. It was full of photographs from the tumultuous events of '68. These were not Grobet's own pictures, but ones procured from others through her connection with the small press, the university, and the world of photojournalism. As viewers advanced through a variety of discrete chambers, they encountered an array of materials, images, and experiences that offered another way to understand photography and the body. One entered the labyrinth through a life-size, mural-scale photograph of a standing nude man that had been bisected to create a portal. And this, you can see it kind of up here, but also this is the main image that I was showing. Once inside the first room, one encountered another human silhouette, this one in paper, to which was attached a mixture of depictions of animal entrails and chips of mica. The images, together with the flash of the stone, was meant to induce a sickly feeling that was further enhanced by an oscillating corridor, which was encountered next. The reference to viscera and mutilation was reinforced in yet another room by a wall of doll parts and scraps of rags. Facing this grisly display was a wall dominated by pictures of police repression, titled with the inscription, "Down with the Electoral Farce." Two photomurals of people behind bars comprised another chamber. A final room was covered with mirrors. In the infinite reflections, refractions, projections of the self offered in this space, one was meant to connect some fragment of the personal image to an aspect of the preceding events of the piece and confront the brutalities of the contemporary world. In Mexico of 1970, Serendipity presented a radical approach to the photographic tradition. The work was infused with the concepts of kineticism and the experiential. By creating an array of environments in an architectural space that required audience participation, Grobet and Tagle finally hoped to provoke the viewer's encounter with him herself. Perhaps because it was an artist group, the works of Proceso Pentágono were always more focused on the larger concept of society, and so this collective was more direct in expressing what was at stake for Mexico outside the boundaries of the art world. The 10th Paris Biennial of Young Artists figured interestingly in the development of Proceso Pentágono and the Mexican artist group movement of the 70s. Each of the biennials usually had a section devoted to an extensive survey of a particular country or area. In 1975, it had been China. For 1977, it was Latin America. Sculptor Helena Escobedo, a veteran of Salon Independiente and by the mid-70s the director of the University Museum of Science and Art at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, was chosen as the curator for the Mexican section. To maximize her country's participation, in place of selected individual artists, she chose 4 artist groups: Proceso Pentágono, Suma, Taller de Arte y Ideología, and Tetrahedro, bringing the number of participants to 30. The group movement had actually been percolating since the late 60s, as evidenced by the activities of Salon Independiente and Arte Otro. In the arena of graphics, collective practice had been standard since the 1940s, with organizations such as the League of Revolutionary Writers and Artists and the Popular Graphic Workshop. And certainly the largest collective and popular shadow was cast by the 20th century mural tradition. Escobedo's decision to send groups rather than particular artists to the Paris Biennial had the effect of bringing this new collective trajectory to the attention of Mexico's visual arts establishment. It pushed the artists to more formally define their cooperative stance as well. Though Proceso Pentágono was officially born in '76 in response to the invitation extended by Escobedo to show in Paris, core group members had already been working together since '73. According to Felipe Ehrenberg, the group's name originally derived from the members' twin interest in chance and process. An early photograph shows 5 chairs with group members Carlos Fink, Victor Munoz, Jose Antonio, and Ehrenberg seated in 4 of them. The 5th empty chair was reserved for hazard or happenstance, azar, a full player in the creative operation. Thus the idea of the Pentagon, a 5-sided figure, stuck. And, as Ehrenberg notes, quote, because we were very much interested in process art, art that took place and developed as it was being made, we called it arte proceso, end quote. Eventually, Lourdes Grobet would also join the group. And you see there on the right, there she is, up there, Lourdes Grobet, 3rd from the right. The piece for the 10th Paris Biennial, Pentágono, a pentagonal-shaped room, made reference to dictatorships and liberation struggles in Latin America and the process of imperialism. The exterior of the structure was wrapped with bands of text and images, digital advertisements for exported Mexican products such as gas, oil, and manual labor, silhouettes of Mexican peasants, along with maps of Mexico. Inside the environment, it evoked a room of military or police interrogation. Several chairs and a table in the room were painted black and stenciled with bright white digits, bringing to mind the serial numbers assigned prisoners. One item appeared to be a crude electric chair fashioned by running 2 wires from a mundane straight-back seat to a faux electrical outlet equipped with a lever high on the wall. Attached to the pentagonal walls were a progression of shelves, Their cubbyhole-like spaces summoned allusions to Joseph Cornell's little boxes of mystery, but the items found in each berth, knives, artificial severed fingers, torn clothes, used shoes, bespoke more violent stories. Interspersed with these articles were small rotating paintings meant to be activated by the audience. Each panel had information on both sides. For instance, a portrait of Chile's assassinated popular president, Salvador Allende, was paired with text from police reports. The apparent whimsical air of Pentágono, with its hall of spinning parts, was on the one hand reminiscent of the familiar diversions in an amusement park. It easily led the viewer from mystified observer to eager participant. Yet on the other hand, the collection of discrete elements and the title of the work conjured the image of a military monstrosity. As critic Alberto Ijar noted at the time, quote, Proceso Pentágono proposes, amuses, and interpolates, signaling clearly the predominant repression in society's icons and in our social totality. The group demonstrates this through a practice based in historical materialism that arrives as process and not as initiatory dogma, end quote. Like Neo-Dada and assemblage, the tangible strength of Proceso Pentágono's installation work lay in the elusive charge of the real-life objects from which it was composed. However, in the adventure of building such environments, the group's fifth player, process, chance, happenstance, often offered more than just fun and games and provided each piece's transformative depth. The informal materiality and patent non-collectibility of art as installation challenged the elitism of traditional arenas of display. At the same time, it allowed artists to seize more gallery and museum real estate, to command larger spaces for larger and more all-encompassing statements. In creating art as installation, the artists that we have been discussing here made spaces of the imagination that glossed the real. It was a practice that allowed them to connect aesthetics in an organic way with life outside the confines of a rarefied art world. Installation's activation of place on both the metaphorical and corporeal planes was an activation of context. Through this practice, as Chantal Boulanger has indicated, artists could create a space of intentionality, one opening to meaning that could be a matrix of signifying systems. In the construction of such fresh frameworks, there was room for a relatively new kind of spectator, or as Oliveira, Oxley, and Petrie have incisively written, quote, what is being charted here, the fracturing of the artwork and the dispersal of meanings across the cultural field, has its corollary in a challenge to the simple integrity of the viewing subject mounted by feminism. Far from being an anonymous or universal cipher, the spectator is sexed and the possessor of a personal cultural history which predisposes him or her to view things in the light of certain interests or assumptions, end quote. If the audience also had a hand in creating context by bringing their experience to the work, this recognition was sparked by remains, materials empowered to tell stories from traces left behind, and discarded materials proved to be graceful bearers of social and political critique. They testified to their own distress while holding evidence of the exigencies that had caused it. In Contextures, written in 1978, by Linda Good Bryant and Marcy S. Phillips, one of the first books to explore non-objective work by African American artists, the authors make a case for contextual practice, one that defines the inherent properties of non-objective art within the context of the external, the affairs of the outside world. Integral to this art form is the use of remains, matter or substance left over from a primary action. Such material, even in abstract configurations, held traces of the milieu and circumstances from which it was drawn, enabling the resulting works to attest in some way to this history. It was such contextual strategies that artists like Lourdes Grobet, Sebastian, David Hammons, Senga Nengudi, and the collectives Proceso Pentágono and Marzo pressed into service. By placing viewers in the center of art's action and meaning, installation as artistic form foregrounded the prospect of actually empowering its audience, in acknowledging that a work would remain unfinished without the participation of the spectator, or putting forth the notion of an artwork as a surface upon which viewers could project their own history. Artists invited their audience to share in the creation of signification. This collaborative situation in sight could become a place of power. Installations thus had the potential to be cast as arenas in which a sense of personal agency could be formed and a political speaking subject could develop. Thank you.
Oh, that was fabulous.
Thank you, sir.
Questions, comments? What happens to, this is one thing I always wanted to know. What happens to, thank you. What happens to hairballs on the beach?
Well, you know, this is the whole thing that comes about with this whole conceptual dematerialization. It's just about the experience. We don't care about the object. In the end, they actually do. Yeah, it's not the lecture tomorrow, but it's the reality. David Hammond still has those things. They still save them. Some of them got washed away, I'm sure. Not all of them are saved, but he has a lot of them. If we go back to, all the way back to the beginning, where you see, well, some of them are also recreated. Here you can see this one on the upper left these pieces have been recreated. Also because the materials are, they're not stable. They're also going to fall apart, even if you try to save them. But believe me, I've seen some of these things that have held on. With Senga Nengudi's Pantyhose and Sand, when I was doing my Now Dig This show at the Hammond Museum, when I called her up and said, look, I want to put you in the show, she said, that's great, but pantyhose and sand don't hang around from the 70s. It's gone. One or two people have them. So I ended up commissioning her to do some new work. Now,
What do you say? How much is pantyhose? How much is
well, I just gave her some money and, said, what I really said was, you can do whatever you want. But she ended up doing these. Now, this piece that you can see here that was purchased by MoMA, in 2003, she had a show at Thomas Urban Gallery. And what she did is she actually recreated works exactly as they were in the Contextures book, right, or in other things. So from her slides, she recreated things. What I told her to do when I did Now Dig This was I said, you can do whatever you want. And so she didn't do recreation, so they're actually new pieces, right, from 2011. But these are actually recreations. So there's a couple of ways you want to go about it. And when I was putting that show together, I'm like, why am I going to borrow a piece from 2003? That makes no sense. I'm just going to pay her to make some new work, which she then sold, and museums have new pieces. So it actually created new pieces in the world. And even though they're using the same technique of pantyhose and sand, they look totally different.
Where's she from?
She's originally from Chicago, and one of the migrants. That's what my LA book is also about. She goes to LA when she's 7 as a child with her mother, who had visited relatives in California and said, this is a place for me, I'm out. And she leaves Chicago and goes there. And she and David Hammons, they shared a studio in this time period, but he's not from Chicago, he's from Springfield. So they have that in common as well.
Kellie, Skip gave me the mic, so I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the next question. Thank you so much for this incredible array of practices, which reminds us how mind-blowing the 70s are and how difficult they are to get a grasp on, right? I'm thinking back to Rosalind Krauss's notes on an index where she starts out and like, how do we make sense of all these practices? And you see some constructivism, and you see this.
Right.
But I wanted to jump off what you were saying at the end, and in reference to the two practices you've just cited, the Hammonds and the Nengudi, because you talked about the remains and the way that the encounter with the remains is, in some sense, what's generating or defining this new viewing subject. But by doing it through remains, it's also making the object into something bodily. you know, and something that has signs of identity, right? And I'm just thinking about how, you know, in the mainstream white art world, the way that abstraction and even pop was kind of constructed as universal, right? And it seems to me that by making it bodily, there's a critical encounter with those practices. And I'm just wondering if, you know, what you would say about that.
That's a great question, thank you. Well, two things I would say about the encounter with pop. You know, they're in California. These two in particular, Nengudi and Hammons, they're in California. And so, you know, this is where pop, in a way, gets its start, really, when they have the show 1962, which I'm going to blank on the title, blah, 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 common objects, blah, blah, blah.
I'm thinking of Rouché's like collapsed boxes, right, versus the paper bags that Hammons is using, where the bags are given these very clear, you know, signs of a kind of bodily traces, which the boxes don't, you know, which Roucché doesn't give, unless it's like the artist's trace, which is a different thing, you know?
Well, you know, pop allows the body to come back. That's, you know, my idea of it anyway. But what these people actually do is they don't want to make, Charles White is one of Hammons's teachers. And of course, you know, that work is very, you know, social realist, beautifully, you know, articulated black bodies, which was important. But they were like, you know, we're not going to do that anymore. But we still want to think about these things. And Hammons, in that quote that I read, well, did I read it? No. Anyway, he's really interested in having hair talk about the body, but not represent it, or represent it but not be an actual realist construction of the body. So they're really interested in that. They're really interested in the fact that these remains do have some kind of relationship to the body, but it's not a recognizable body. And it is, you know, it's a black body in Hammons through hair, but it's not an image,
right.
You know, a realist photographic, if you will.
Trace
a realist
versus representation, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's an important shift for this.
Yeah,
for this.
It's trace, but it also, for them, is a representation of sorts. But it also takes race out of it to some degree. But they're still, you know, they're on the fence, right? They still want it all. They still want it all. Yes, sir.
So thanks, yes. I just wanted to ask about the economics of all of this, because, you know, who pays for the performance? How do they survive if they've got nothing to sell at the end of it? Or maybe they do.
Well, right. Well, nobody wanted to buy their stuff anyway. That's what they also talk about. They like, the black people didn't want to buy it, the white people didn't want to buy it, so we're just going to make it and just forget about it. You know, we can think about musicians in the same way. I mean, they're not getting paid a lot of money to do a lot of things sometimes. So, you know, you just do it. You know, and also the economics also does this, which is, that's why you use pantyhose. And she's not using new pantyhose. I mean, when we did the, you know, the new pieces in 2011, she was driving us crazy. She wanted to find pantyhose in the thrift shop. We're like, old pantyhose? I'm like, who does that? You know, like, where are you going to find old pantyhose? You know, but apparently there are places that have, you know, old pantyhose. I don't know. She didn't want the new pantyhose from 2011 don't look like the pantyhose from the 70s. But the pantyhose were used. This was the whole point. So it's economical because you're finding things that are cast off, right? You're finding all these things that are cast off. So that's the economics of it. If nobody's paying you for it anyway, you know. And Hammons moves to that. What's interesting about Hammons is that he moves to that because he's actually making works that begin to sell, right? Those body prints are very saleable. But he doesn't want to get caught up in the box of that, and he kind of moves away and stops making them, you know, but good, you know, luckily for those people who have them, it's very good for them. But, you know, so it's always, you know, there's this moment where people are rejecting the economics, but then later on they're like, ooh, I wish I had that because now a body print is selling for whatever, or now these works are selling for whatever, particularly Hammons, you know. But also it's like universities and other places commission art spaces, will give you a little bit of money for stuff at that time. So there's ways that they worked in that way as well.
You know, just thinking that in the 70s in Europe, generally, there were funds and art students could survive and get some sort of income and at the same time do works that had no commercial value. And just thinking the economics in California are rather different.
Well, they all had jobs too.
Well,
You know,
did,
I mean, yeah, they had jobs. You know, everybody has a day job, right? Whatever it is. Senga Nengudi worked at the Pasadena Museum of Art, or Pasadena Art Museum, and you know, she learned stuff there too. I mean, other artists, not so much Hammons, somebody like a John Outerbridge, for instance, in LA, worked as an installer. A lot of people worked as installers, preparators at different places. So people had day jobs. And they were actually happy to have those jobs because they didn't have to be a bus driver. Not that that was a bad job, but it allowed them to, they thought, to think about art all the time. Of course, then sometimes they got sick of that. You know, they're thinking about it at work, and then they come home, would have to think about it. So maybe the bus driver wasn't so bad. But, you know, so there's all sorts of ways that people support their habit, whether or not anybody's buying it. And the beauty of it is, though, that to be able to celebrate these people now, and my exhibition Now Dig This, and these different exhibitions where you look back at these people, they actually are able, you know, it shines a light on them, and if they still have a few little pieces, they're able to sell them, you know, or make new pieces or have new shows.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you so much for your lecture. I always just learned so much. I wanted to know, you mentioned the group Marzo and that they had been harassed for making the urban poems, and I just wondered what you meant by that. Had they been arrested or under surveillance, or if you could just kind of comment on that?
Yeah, all those type of things, because they're doing, you know, these, you know, things in the street, and, you know, people are, you know, they're causing crowds. People are making poems that are, at that point, probably, you know, reactive, even still, because, you know, it's not really till many, many years later that more information begins to come out about exactly, you know, the government doesn't give up any information about that 68 massacre for decades. Right, so people are still in that, and they're still being, you know, there's still a police presence around, and so, you know, they're really causing people to gather and create protest poems. And this kind of way of working is still, you know, you see this in some Latin American countries. I think in Peru, people were also working with that, writing on the ground and stuff. So this is something that actually has taken hold, and maybe it's even older than this, but certainly I know it from these guys. There's somebody, and then...
Okay. I want to thank you for these lectures, but also for the exhibitions that you've presented, in which I'm thinking of Now Dig This, and you know, it's an incredible presentation that is in itself a memorial. Like when you talked about the remains or the traces at the end just now of your talk, I thought about some of the installations in the exhibition and the slides that you show, and the way in which the pieces, which we might not be able to interact with any longer, still have an embodied feeling in the galleries, so that they're remains, but they're memorializing both the acts of their production and also the people involved in the various ways of their making, including the former audiences. And I think that it's remarkable that you've been able to create these museum shows that communicate that. So I wanted to thank you for that, but to also ask a question that relates back to your comments, especially towards the end, though they do tie up so much of the preceding talk, which relates in part to both engagement and to audience, and to the ways in which the artists that you're talking about all have their own personal engagements with larger artistic and other communities that represent many of the issues that they're concerned with at the times that they're making their work and thinking about it. And so I kind of wondered, especially when I saw that Hammond's installation on beaches, which, you know, there's so much today of people looking back and thinking about the segregation of beaches. And I'm kind of wondering also, like I was thinking about Barbara Smith doing performances on beaches probably around the exact same time, where she may not have had any audience and may not have even wanted one. And so I'm just kind of wondering both about whether he was potentially reflecting on that issue and the idea of artists who are coming together in, you know, sort of numbers that maybe in some cases cast aside some of the segregation of the beaches themselves. In other words, you know, there were different artists who were coming together at those beaches, maybe with him at the performance, whether he's commenting on both segregationist practices still prevalent in the city and according to its beaches. And also, so that's one question related to that piece, and also who the audience, did he have an audience for that? Because it does seem like an incredible performative project, and whether that audience was in its making also. So, you know, I guess I'm interested in exceeding the gallery, whether there was an audience that was a non-art world audience as well.
Right. Thank you for those questions. I think that, I don't know about David and segregation and beaches, but that's a good question to ask him, whether or not you're going to get an answer, which you probably won't. But anyway, you know, it's interesting to think about it because, you know, he does come from Springfield, Illinois. You know, he did grow up during times of segregation. So I wonder, but, you know, you will never get an answer. I mean, maybe you will. I won't get a straight answer out of him, so you never know about that. Who was the audience? You know, the audience, as they said, you know, nobody was buying my work. Black people weren't buying it. White people weren't buying it. Who was the audience? The audience were other artists, you know. Who was the audience for that work? I'm not sure who else was there. Certainly the guy who takes the pictures, who has these pictures, Bruce Tolleman, was there. Now, it could just be a private performance. A lot of David's performances are very private. They're not about audience. You know, if he says he's going to do a performance for you and you sit here and wait, you can just sit here and wait because he's not going to show up. He'll show up when you're not thinking about it. He likes the accidental audience. And so he and Adrian Piper are very similar in that. They like this idea of art lurking in the midst of things, right? Where the audience is kind of this accidental. He has other performances, which I won't be talking about, where he actually just goes to a bus stop. One day he goes and he paints a little graffiti, he leaves. He comes back in, you know, with his little costume, and he just stands there and hangs around while people, and kind of points to this graffiti, which is actually political graffiti, and to people at the bus stop, you know. But he doesn't talk about that. Senga Nengudi told me that story, you know. But this is, so he's very, you know, his performances and his idea of audience, it's always very low key. You have to really be paying attention. That's the idea that I get. But he's, you know, he's also trained as a commercial artist. So he's very cagey about audience. Who is the audience? He, you know, gets this documentation of his work. You know, he doesn't have video, but he has these things. He has these ways of, you know, telling people about, you know, keeping hold of these ideas so we always know about it. So he's cagey about it in a way, but it's also very subtle in terms of, you know, I'm not going to be there when you want me to be there, but I will do it at some point. But he has a way of kind of, I guess what I want to say is he's kind of an archivist in that certain way, in a way that was looked down upon at a certain point in that moment, but he was always, you know, keeping these archives or keeping these things that allowed him to be who he is.
The mention of the archivist is fantastic, just because I had been thinking about Noah Purfoy and another kind of archiving and audience engagement. So thank you so much for that response.
I mean, for me, what's great about doing something like these shows, particularly Now Dig This, is that you know, people say, why do you keep curating? Because, you know, when you teach this work, how do you see it? It's not at the Met or MoMA. Now it's starting to be, but it's not a great, you know, place where you could just pop in and see all the works you need to know about. You can't see, you know, how many Picassos do they have up at MoMA? You know, can you see that many David Hammonds up? Even though they actually do have them. But now, but, you know, so this is one of the reasons why I kept being dragged into this, because, you know, how do my students actually see these pieces? You know, so that's one reason to continue showing these and commissioning artists and doing these things.
You mentioned Houston Conwell briefly in your talk, and he's a very different figure in the sense that I guess a lot of people are familiar with his permanent installations, but you mentioned that him in the context of more ephemeral, audience-engaged work, and I wondered if you could share a few details about that period of his career.
Well, he also did performances, and he made objects which were made from latex called petrographs. He also made things called juju bags, and then these things are made from this Roplex. They were types of paintings that actually didn't last. It's hard to find them now because the materials were not stable. But he made these things, but he also performed in them. And so there are videos of some of his performances that were done by Ulysses Jenkins, another artist that performed with Hammons and Hassinger, and I'll talk more about these people tomorrow. But there's some documentation of that. And there's also photographs of his performances. But they were more ritualized than these guys. These guys are much more about trace, about remains, about this kind of indefinability. Houston Conwell is much more kind of visual ritual that you can trace, that you can understand. And he's raised a Catholic, so this kind of liturgical idea in his work and also in his performances is a strong element. Yeah, but the more permanent work comes later in the 90s, where he does these kind of, these permanent site works that he does in collaboration with his sister and an architect. And of course, the one that's in New York at the Schomburg is one of the more famous one, under which Langston Hughes' ashes are buried, apparently. So yeah, one to check out. Other questions?
Question? Yes. Lawrence?
The image of serendipity reminded me of work by Ilya Kabakov. Do you see any connections or?
Well, it could be the kind of, if we want to think about the kind of constructivist angle that Professor Kelsey was talking about, that could be it. Because they, one thing about the Mexican context as opposed to the African American context, geometricism is really big. And I think over the last few years we can talk about the vogue for geometric studies on geometric painting in Latin America, particularly in Argentina and Venezuela. But the whole constructivist idea, we can think about being a part of that as well. I mean, geometricism coming sometimes from that, but also from neoplasticism. In Brazil, Max Bill is really big. When the Sao Paulo Bienal starts in 1951, he has a big show. It has a major impact in Latin America, in Brazil, and if we think about the Sao Paulo Bienal having a major impact in Latin America itself, we can see how that geometricism goes out from there. But also in terms of how geometricism comes into the country as people are escaping World War II. You have a lot of people who are refugees from World War II that come and bring some of these ideas. Some of the artists are also over in Europe, where they're getting these ideas also from Europe, and then come back. I think of Torres Garcia, right, who lives in Europe and then comes back. I mean, and also we can think about, going way back, we can think about a Cubism kind of influence in people like Diego Rivera, who lives in Europe and then has a whole Cubist phase, which you can see at MoMA, and then, or at least one painting of it, and comes back and brings that idea to Latin America. So we can think about how how does that all? I'm thinking about geometricism, but I'm also thinking about it in the Russian context as well, and so how that kind of also relates to the history of art in terms of the kind of geometric kind of push that you see in the 20th century. We can think about that. I mean, it's not off base as well. And also, I guess, thinking about the way that in handcuffs work, how that works with violence and distress, but also the kind of texture of it as well, that kind of undercurrent that is also very structured somehow. So, I don't know if I would say it, but it's an interesting point of view. Thank you, Florence.
Oh, could I get one in? Yeah. Thank you. Kellie, thank you so much. I wanted to actually ask you about this piece, Serendipity, but the next slide that you have, where you're showing, yeah. So are these kind of virtual models of the show, or did you compose these, or are these the actual pieces? I'm thinking of the installation you could actually walk through. Could you tell me a little bit more about these?
These are models that the artist, one of the things particularly about the Mexican artist is that the images, I mean, I have a lot of, having worked on a lot of the African-American artists recently, and particularly with Now Dig This, I have a lot of images. The Latin American images they're very archival, so I have to go and actually grab people for these images. These are the ones that she has published of this piece. Now, a lot of times why you're seeing something like this, so this is a model that she put together. I didn't do this. People are doing this because, first of all, it's very hard to document. Right. And, they go away. Unless you're somebody like Hammons, like I said, who's somehow, because in his commercial mind, is thinking about, let's document, because again, the mode of the time is, we don't need this. We don't need the object. We don't need all this stuff. It's about the experience. Later on, it's like, I wish I had that picture, So she's actually reinventing how you would go through this. And so these are basically her models of how you would go through the exhibition.
Yeah,
so I mean, that's basically, we have the description, a very strong description, which I base a lot of my text on, and also that very few visuals.
But
right.
This is after the fact then? It's
you know,
yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
It looks like it's done after the fact, certainly to me. I mean, but I haven't ascertained that from the artists or from the writings about who did this. But I would imagine that it looks very computerized. It doesn't look like she made it in 1970. I mean, we're not talking about the 70s. We're talking 1970 on the dot, in punto, like right on the dot. So I would imagine this is, thinking about it later, she does have, I think this is the main image that she has from the past. So this image is probably more historical, maybe not the background of it, but certainly this part here is something she may have taken or somebody may have taken, and then from that they extrapolated how you go through it. But, this idea of the labyrinth and this kind of experiential thing, and, a lot of artists were doing this. Other artists, Latin American artists who are doing it, or somebody like Marta Minujín is another artist who is doing these kind of things as well, these kind of experiential things. And we can think of, other artists and installations, somebody like Alan Capro and other, where you're in a room and you have to go through these kind of different stages of the installation.
It struck me that way, especially when we were talking about the archiving and kind of saving or conservation of ephemera, but also the idea of memory, and even artistic memory going back, kind of portraying this with such virtual tools. And the feeling that I got from looking at it was this cramped sense. So I'm wondering, like, what was it like to go through the installation? What was it like in her mind for people to go through the installation? And then how she's thinking of it now, puts this kind of layering on top of the temporal happening. But thanks for explaining that, because I was lost. I was like, where is that? Was that part of it? Did you create that? But the second part of my question has to do with your discussion of the Mexican artists and race? Because you're kind of doing this kind of juxtaposition and winding, where you're talking about some African-American conceptual artists and the installations, and then you're going back to this kind of Mexican moment of conceptual art that picks up on that kind of democracy, street action that you were talking of. So have you come across any kind of expressions or grapplings of race within that Mexican community? I mean, you talked about some of them that were going to England, for example, that already had this kind of diaspora Black moment on the margins. And so I'm just wondering, if are there more connective tissues between these two groups?
You know, not that I've found so far. And I think, you know, obviously there's more to be done. And there are people working on it, not in this moment, but certainly, you know, the kind of Black Mexican moment. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do earlier, too, particularly if you think about the founding of Los Angeles, and, you know, the people who found it are primarily people of color, and they're coming from Mexico, basically, and also the border in a certain moment, 19th century, as being a safe space for Black people because Mexico outlawed slavery, right? So Mexico was a safer space for Black people at a certain point, and Gerald Horne has a book, can't remember the title, Black and Brown, I think it is, about, yeah, in the early 20th century, about the relationships between Mexicans and African Americans around race. But in the 70s, you know, like I said, these people are not known to each other. These artists, not necessarily, as I haven't found it yet. I mean, they're really dealing with different universes. The Mexican artists tend to be more elite. Artists in Latin America at a certain point are more elite because they, you know, poor people can't afford to be artists so much. I mean, this begins to change after a while. But the African American artists are not necessarily coming from an elite class. You know, and some people have said, well, how can you really compare these people? But part of the reason that I can is because, you know, people have said to me, well, why don't you do Mexicans and Chicanos or African Americans and Chicanos? Why are you doing African Americans and Mexicans? And it really comes back to the moment of the Mexican mural movement, Mexican mural renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance, and how those two art histories begin to evolve, for me, very parallel in terms of looking about nationality, ethnicity, democracy. There is also a connection when, you know, in the 30s and 40s, and even the 20s, when African American artists go to Mexico, as many artists American artists go to Mexico, inspired by the Mexican mural renaissance, right? And African Americans are among them. And for them, it has, you know, there's been exhibitions on this. Yeah, Elizabeth Catlett, right, right. But that idea of, you know, revolution, of throwing down, you know, the dictators and the powers, you know, but also in works by people like, in many of the Tres Grandes, but particularly, you know, well-known in Rivera's work, the kind of celebration of the indigenous people that African Americans really felt kindred with. And then, as Professor Gates said, you know, Elizabeth Catlett went down there with her husband, Charles White, at the time, and they had a little fellowship down there in the 40s, and he came back, and she stayed down there and married Pancho Mora. She was like, I'm done, bye, you know. So there are things that you can talk, you know, there are relationships that you can talk about. The 70s, I haven't really found that one yet, besides, you know, Angela Davis, you know, the Angela Davis moment when people like Elizabeth Catlett are, you know, sending funds, making art to support her, and people in Mexico are also sending funds for her release from jail and so on, for her legal fees. So there are those kind of interactions, but the artists that I'm thinking about, I haven't really found that connection yet. But I still believe, and another kind of relationship that they have is that, if you think about the way we can talk about African Americans and the relationship to Brazil and race, right? People do it all the time. But the reality is, at this moment, Brazil is under a dictatorship, right? We're not under a dictatorship in the United States, as far as I know, at that time. It may be violent. There may be, police actions, right, and government actions, but we are not under dictatorship. But yet people will, put those together because of race. But I think the Mexican connection with the African American connection makes even more sense because Mexico is also not under a dictatorship. Now, there may be military activities and police activities, but they are also not under a dictatorship, right? So I think that those kind of things, but we still have these same kind of violence going on against the body that they are responding to. So for me, all those things made this kind of parallel work on many, many levels, even if they didn't particularly know each other.
Yeah, but there are a lot of historical connections. I mean, more slaves went to Mexico and Peru than came to the United States. And then there are two huge black areas, the Costa Chica around Veracruz, and the second president who actually abolished slavery was black, a mulatto, Vicente Guerrero, who was killed, assassinated, just like Abraham Lincoln in 1829 or 1830. So, but Mexico has been in denial about its blackness since 1829 or 1830.
There you have it.
Question?
Yes.
Professor Jones, thank you so much. I'm really overwhelmed by your two presentations because of all the connections, and I wanted to pick up on Dell's comment and actually Vera's because I was wanting to ask you about the populism of the art and how it related between the two moments. So because with the group, the Marceau group, it was obvious that they were engaging the public, but I wasn't sure with these other works here, was there an involvement, with more of the popular black arts movement? Was there involvement with these kinds of process, media, performance, these ephemeral types of projects? Do they live in the memories of non-artists, let's say, do you think?
So when you say a popular black arts movement, what do you mean, like posters and so on?
What's more known to the average person, maybe theater, you mentioned yesterday the theatrical connections, and when we think of black arts, poetry,
Okay.
but as I was watching you talk about some of these other artists and some of the work and how it's really ephemeral, I just was really taken with this idea of oral history in addition to archiving. Like, would someone maybe from that time have memory of some of these moments that weren't artists? And, because I thought the imagery was really interesting with Marceau, that there were people who participated in that, and I just didn't know if that was the case as much with the African-American artists.
Yeah, I mean, I can show you a picture of, I cut down many things, but there are people, there are images of interactions with Senga Nengudi works, for instance. And then, you see her other colleague interacting. But, they also, as I said, Hammons, he likes to keep it just lurking there. So who knows? I mean, is he documenting? I think in one of the pieces that is a performance, you see people in it. But they are there, do we have documents of these things? I mean, it's kind of like Adrian Piper as well, do we have documents showing that? And that wasn't the point. They can tell you it happened, but do we have people who have come forward and said, yes, I saw that David Hammons on the beach, who was somebody who is not related to this project? I haven't heard them, but if you meet them, please give them my email address. I'd love to know who they are. Man, what is that, Yeah, exactly. Well, who did that? Why is that there? There are other people where you can document it, but I think the problem is that it's not necessarily documented, and they didn't want to document it. And it's just accidentally documented, and because of these accidental documents, that's how we're building art history from there, as well as the oral history with the artists themselves. So that's how oral history, as you said, is the way we'll find out. Mm-hmm.
Final question or comment? If not, let's thank Kellie very much.
Thank you all very much.